The night is gentle, and time unfolds like a quiet breath. You are drifting through the centuries, following the slow rhythm of water and stone. The world grows older, but the desire for order remains. The wish to make chaos livable, to build something that endures. Far before our age of glass and noise, people shaped their homes from patience. They placed their walls with care, angled their streets toward wind and light, and let water decide where the city would breathe. Every drain, every channel, every stone had a reason. Nothing was wasted, nothing was rushed. In those early cities, architecture was not a matter of pride, but of survival. It kept the world steady. It taught people how to live with balance. Between dirt and cleanliness, between rain and drought, between life that grows and life that fades. The ancients understood that order was not just a human invention, it was a conversation with nature. The curve of a roof followed the sky, the slope of a street followed the path of rain. Each detail served a rhythm larger than any ruler or law. And in the hum of those ancient towns, the same quiet music repeated itself. Water flowing, cloth drying, footsteps echoing in narrow lanes. The world was imperfect, but functional. The city breathed, exhaled, and rested like a living thing. When you walk through ruins now, in the dust of old markets, in the shadow of collapsed baths, you can still sense it. The precision, the thought, the care that outlived its makers. The bones of order remain, even when the flesh of history has gone. It is strange how silence preserves what words cannot. The drains still remember the flow. The walls still know the sound of wind. Even when no one listens, the city keeps whispering, keep it balanced, keep it clean, keep it alive. And so as you close your eyes tonight, imagine that rhythm still moving beneath you, unseen, patient, eternal. The steady pulse of human order, humming softly through the centuries. When bathing was dangerous, the night drifts slowly, the air carrying the faint scent of smoke and damp earth, the smell of a world before soap, before showers, before the comfort of clean water, waiting behind a tap. It is the 14th century. You are in a small town somewhere in Europe. The streets are narrow, paved with uneven stones that stay wet long after the rain has passed. The houses lean inward, as if whispering secrets across the road. And inside, behind heavy doors and shuttered windows, people live close to the warmth of their hearths and the cool breath of superstition. They did not fear the dark or the mud or even the plague as much as they feared hot water. To them, water was not purity, it was danger. The logic was simple and wrong, but understandable. When the body touched warm water, the pores opened. When the pores opened, sickness could slip in. Illness was thought to travel through air and water like a ghost, invisible but patient. To bathe, therefore, was to invite the world inside your skin. Once, not long before, things had been different. In earlier centuries, people bathed often. Monasteries kept bathhouses. Roman traditions of soaking and scrubbing had survived in small corners of Europe. Stone pools filled with warm water, the air heavy with steam and herbs. Bathing had been seen as healthy, even holy, a way to care for both body and mind. But slowly, as fear and misunderstanding grew, the water changed meaning. What was once cleansing became corrupt. The more people tried to avoid disease, the more they began to avoid bathing. By the late Middle Ages, public bathhouses stood like empty shells. Once places of laughter and conversation, they had become silent, shuttered, or repurposed. Some were turned into bakeries, some left to rot. The few that remained open were whispered about. Places of temptation and trouble, not of hygiene. Parents warned their children to stay away, and respectable citizens pretended they had never gone. So people adapted. They invented a new kind of cleanliness, one that avoided water altogether. They kept to what they called dry washing. A bowl of warm water, a cloth of soft linen, and perhaps a few leaves of sage or rosemary steeped in the heat. They would wipe their hands, their faces, their feet. Never all at once, never fully but carefully, in small, safe gestures. The idea was not to become spotless, but to remain not too dirty. Clean meant not worse than yesterday. The poor did what they could. In the villages, people used rivers in summer, but in the colder months they relied on cloth and patience. A farmer might wash his face with the same water used to rinse his tools and think nothing of it. His wife would soak her linen in vinegar and herbs, wiping away the sweat of a long day. They were practical people. They knew water could refresh, but they also knew it could kill. The wealthy had more choices, though comfort did not always mean wisdom. In large houses, servants heated water over fire, carried it in heavy buckets, and poured it into wooden tubs lined with linen sheets. Lavender or mint might be added, not for cleanliness, but for the scent. The nobleman would step in cautiously, fearing that warmth might steal his strength. The bath would last only a few minutes. The water cooled quickly, and the fear remained longer. Afterward, they rubbed their skin with dry cloths, as if to seal the body back against the world. People talked about the danger of open pores the way we talk about bad weather, casually, but with conviction. A good man, they said, stayed dry. A good woman kept her modesty, her layers of clothing intact. The idea of standing naked in hot water was almost scandalous. So they wore more shirts, shifts, tunics, and let the fabric absorb what the water no longer washed away. Under the layers of wool and linen, the human scent of the age gathered quietly. But no one complained, not really. When everyone smelled the same, it stopped being strange. It was simply life, earthy, smoky, alive. To smell of sweat and work was to belong. Yet, even in this world of careful distance from water, there was still an unspoken longing. A longing for the warmth of a real bath, for the lightness that comes after stepping out clean. People remembered the stories of Roman baths where water flowed through marble channels, of times when bathing was a joy, not a sin. And so, in secret, a few still did it. They filled small barrels, poured in herbs, and closed the door tight. Steam rose, carrying both fear and comfort. For a few moments, they forgot the world outside and let the water touch them again. Not everyone who bathed fell sick, but stories spread faster than truth. A traveler might wash in a river and catch a fever days later, and the bath, not the bacteria, would be blamed. Word would travel. He let the water in. And another nail would close the lid on the custom of bathing. There were those who missed the sound of water in public places, the laughter from the old bathhouses, the clatter of wooden sandals on wet floors, the scent of rosemary floating on steam. Those memories faded slowly, replaced by quieter rituals, changing linen, brushing hair, airing clothes in the sun. Cleanliness became a matter of habit, not immersion. At night, before bed, many wiped their faces with warm water and vinegar. They believed the mixture purified without risk. Parents washed their children's hands, their little feet, whispering that the water must be just cool enough, never hot, never dangerous. Even the monks, once faithful keepers of bathing traditions, reduced their baths to certain days of the year. The rest of the time they simply wiped themselves down and prayed for health. You can imagine the streets of a medieval town on a warm day, the air thick with the smell of animals, smoke, bread, and people. It was not unpleasant to them. It was familiar, part of the rhythm of life. The scent of humanity was everywhere, and still, despite the dirt and the superstition, there was a strange kind of order. Each person, in their own way, tried to stay clean. They brushed, they wiped, they changed their linen. They did not seek perfection, only balance. The world was unpredictable, but one could control a small circle, a basin, a cloth, a body, still warm from the fire. So when we think of the Middle Ages, we often picture filth and chaos, but that is only half the truth. The other half is quiet, domestic, careful. A woman wringing out her cloth by the window, a man folding a clean shirt and setting it near the fire to dry. It is the story of people learning to live safely in their own skin with what they had and with what they believed. And maybe, if you listen closely, you can still hear it. The sound of water poured from a wooden bucket, a sigh of relief. The whisper of steam fading into the cold air. For them, bathing was never about luxury. It was about courage. Public baths from warmth to silence. In the beginning, the sound of water was part of life. Steady, human, comforting. Before fear began to whisper its warnings, bathhouses were not places of suspicion but of warmth. Imagine a medieval town at twilight. The streets are narrow, the air smells faintly of wood smoke and bread, and in one corner of the city there is a low building from which steam escapes through the roof tiles. Inside, water murmurs softly in wooden tubs and voices mingle with laughter. This is the bathhouse, a place where bodies and words find the same temperature. For centuries, bathing was not a luxury. It was a rhythm, a habit, a moment of pause. Men and women came here after long days of work. They carried fatigue on their backs, soot on their hands, and silence in their mouths. The water welcomed them all without question. It was clean, warm, and forgiving. Beneath the light of oil lamps, the steam thickened, and the world outside, the noise, the dirt, the hierarchy, melted away. In the bath, a merchant could sit beside a carpenter, a monk beside a traveler. The water made them equals, if only for an hour. There were attendants who poured water, wiped benches, and carried bundles of herbs. Rosemary for strength, lavender for calm, mint to keep the air sharp and sweet. Some bathhouses even served food and ale. People would talk about the harvest, the weather, or the price of wool, while steam wrapped them in a communal fog. The world outside felt cleaner when one left the bathhouse, as though the streets themselves borrowed a bit of that warmth. But time has a way of twisting comfort into caution. By the 13th century, the warm pools that had once promised relief began to invite unease. Rumors spread faster than water, that sin lingered in steam, that too much warmth weakened the body, that behind closed doors, modesty and morality both slipped away. Bathhouses, once centers of public health, were now whispered about as places of temptation. The same rooms that had echoed with laughter began to fill with gossip. Who was seen at the bathhouse became as meaningful as who did not go. Fear of illness added another layer. Doctors, armed with theories but not understanding, began to warn against bathing during outbreaks. They believed that disease entered through the pores, that hot water opened invisible gates on the skin through which death could crawl. A man might feel healthy when he entered the bath, they said, but by nightfall the plague would find him. And so one by one the bathhouses began to close. At first, the closures were temporary. Just until the fever passes, they said. But the fever never truly passed. When the Black Death arrived, the fear hardened into law. Authorities ordered bathhouses to be boarded up. Steam rising from a roof became a sign of danger, not comfort. The air around the doors grew cold and still. Wooden tubs dried out and cracked. The smell of herbs and soap was replaced by the dry dust of abandonment. Some bathhouses were repurposed. A few turned into bakeries or storage rooms. Others became homes for animals or the poor. The idea of sharing warm water with strangers, once normal, almost sacred, now felt reckless. It was as though the city itself forgot how to breathe deeply. Yet not all the closures were born of fear. Some were moral. The church, already wary of anything that combined nakedness with pleasure, declared public bathing indecent. Priests preached that to uncover the body was to uncover the soul's weakness. The same water that once symbolized purity now carried the scent of sin. In sermons, the bathhouse became a metaphor for temptation, and in time, a memory of shame. People stopped speaking of them aloud. The silence that followed was heavy. The streets, once warmed by the rising mist from communal baths, felt colder. The winter months grew longer. Neighbors no longer met over tubs of water, and casual laughter gave way to polite distance. Cleanliness became private, fragmented. A damp cloth in a basin, a quick rinse at home. Hygiene was no longer shared, it was hidden. Still, in the quiet corners of cities, a few bathhouses refused to die. In southern Europe, where the climate was warmer and Roman traditions lingered, steam continued to rise. A handful of bathhouses survived, small, discreet, almost secret. They served travelers, soldiers, or those who did not fear the whispers. Behind thick walls, they carried on the old rituals, pouring water over stones, mixing herbs, speaking softly in the haze. To step inside one was to enter another time, a world where touch was not dangerous and water was still kind. But even these survivors bore scars. To protect themselves, they changed names and customs. Bath attendants were called healers, not bathers. Steam rooms were rebranded as herbal chambers. Everything was made to sound medicinal, scientific, respectable. And still the suspicion clung to them like damp air. As the centuries turned, the empty bathhouses stood like fossils, reminders of a softer past. Dust gathered on the stones, moss crept along the basins, and rain found its way through broken roofs. Children played near them, unaware of what they had been. The older ones still remembered the sound of laughter through steam, the sigh of water poured into a wooden tub, the relief of sinking into warmth after a long day. Those memories lived quietly, like coals that refused to go out. In the towns that had lost their bathhouses, new habits took root. People began to associate cleanliness with linen instead of water. Shirts and undergarments were changed often, and the sun was trusted more than soap. A clean shirt meant a clean soul. Yet the body still longed for immersion, for the feeling of floating, of warmth, of silence. So from time to time, a basin was filled, a door was locked, and someone somewhere sat in the water again, pretending not to miss what had been forbidden. The disappearance of the bathhouse changed more than hygiene. It changed how people related to one another. Where there had once been easy conversation, merchants discussing trade, lovers whispering behind steam, children splashing near their mothers, there was now separation. The act of bathing, once social, became solitary. And perhaps in that solitude, Europe learned to be more private, more modest, more distant. Centuries later, when public baths returned, they were reborn as something different. Tiled, clinical, efficient. They belonged to a world of plumbing and science, not of shared silence and wooden tubs. The old warmth, that communal, almost sacred feeling, never truly came back. But if you close your eyes tonight, you might still feel it. The echo of a time when water meant connection, when steam was the common breath of the town, when people washed not just their skin, but the fatigue of living among others. The bathhouse was never just a place to get clean. It was a place to remember what it meant to belong, to touch, to share, to exist side by side in warmth. And then, one day, it was gone. The doors closed, the fires went out, and the water cooled into silence. The city learned to live without it. But somewhere deep in its bones, in every pipe and puddle that came after, the memory of that warmth remains, waiting quietly, beneath the dust, beneath the fear, beneath the centuries. Bathing at home, privilege and habit. At home, bathing became a luxury, an event rather than a habit. The few who could afford it turned the act of washing into a ritual of preparation and patience. Servants carried buckets of boiling water from the hearth, their arms trembling with the weight. They poured it into a large wooden tub lined carefully with linen to keep splinters from the skin. The room filled with the smell of steam and wet cloth. Someone might scatter herbs into the water, lavender, sage, or mint, not to disinfect, but to disguise the scent of wood smoke and animal fat that clung to everything. For a noble household, a bath was both a privilege and a spectacle. A squire might test the water first, dipping a hand to make sure it was not too hot. The master entered slowly, wincing at the warmth, sitting just long enough for the novelty to fade. His wife might bathe afterward, or sometimes beside him, separated by a thin curtain for modesty. To share a bath was an intimacy beyond words, something whispered about, but rarely admitted. The servants waited discreetly, eyes averted, ready with towels made of rough cloth. When the water cooled, it was poured out into the courtyard, cloudy, fragrant, and done. For the poor, bathing was not ceremony but necessity. They bathed in rivers, ponds, or wooden barrels when the weather allowed. In summer, children laughed and splashed in shallow water while their parents washed clothes nearby. In winter, the rivers turned to ice, and the idea of stepping into water was unthinkable. Then cleanliness meant endurance, a damp cloth by the fire, a rinse for the hands and face, a change of shirt, enough to feel human again. Water itself was heavy work. To heat it meant chopping wood, carrying buckets, tending fires that filled the house with smoke. Few households had the means or the strength to waste that effort on comfort. So people saved bathing for special occasions, the birth of a child, the recovery from illness, the visit of a guest. Even then, it was done quietly, without boasting. There was pride in modesty, in enduring the cold rather than indulging the warmth. In many homes, the bath shared space with life itself. The same room served as kitchen, bedroom, and laundry. Steam rose between hanging clothes and drying herbs. A single window let in pale light, catching the dust in its beam. You can almost hear the rhythm. Water poured, cloth wrung, the sound of someone humming softly to fill the silence. It was not glamour. It was survival wrapped in care. The scent of herbs meant comfort. A handful of rosemary boiled in water gave a sharp, clean smell that lingered even after the bath was drained. Mint masked the odor of smoke. Sage was thought to keep the body strong, though no one could explain how. These herbs grew in small garden plots behind cottages where women tended them like quiet guardians of health. A few leaves in a pot of water could transform a bucket bath into something tender. Bathing in the cold months was an act of courage. The room had to be warmed first, the door closed tight to keep the wind away. The tub stood near the hearth, the fire snapping and spitting. Sometimes the bather's breath rose in clouds above the steam. There was always the fear of catching chill afterward, so the body was wrapped quickly in blankets, the hair dried near the fire. A hot drink of ale or milk followed, not luxury, but protection. For many, cleanliness meant not bathing, but renewing. To wash one's linen was to cleanse the body by proxy. Shirts and shifts were boiled, beaten, and dried in the open air. The smell of soap, animal fat mixed with ash, drifted through villages, sharp and bitter. But when the laundry was done and the linen laid out white and stiff on the bed, it brought a strange satisfaction. A fresh shirt against the skin felt like a small beginning, a reset of the day. People spoke of it the way we might speak of rain after drought. Children were often the cleanest in the household, if only because they were washed by others. Mothers wiped their faces with damp cloths, combed through their hair with fine-toothed wooden combs, and rubbed their small hands with vinegar to ward off infection. Babies were sometimes bathed in wooden bowls, their cries echoing in the narrow rooms. Water was scarce, but affection was not. For travelers and workers, rivers remained the only real bath. On warm evenings, men stripped to their waists and stepped into the shallows, washing away dust and fatigue. They used sand to scrub the skin, rinsed with cold water, then let the air dry them. It was brief, rough, and liberating. In those moments, the river itself seemed to forgive the world's dirt. Yet for all its simplicity, bathing remained bound to class. In manor houses, a bath could mean status, proof that you had time to indulge. In peasant homes, it was a burden. One demanded labor, the other demanded survival, and still in every household, no matter the wealth, there was the same sigh when warm water touched cold skin. That sigh was older than language, older than fear. As years went on, small customs evolved to replace full bathing. People sprinkled rosewater on their clothes, rubbed hands with vinegar, brushed hair daily to remove dust. Perfume made from herbs or oil was dabbed behind ears and on collars. It did not clean, but it pretended to. Scent became a way to rewrite the story of the body, to smell less like the fields and more like something controlled. But most believed true cleanliness came from within, through food, temperance, and prayer. The body followed the mind, they said, and the mind followed discipline. To wash one's thoughts was more important than to wash one's skin. And so, as the water cooled and superstition deepened, hygiene turned inward, a private, moral exercise instead of a physical one. Still, the longing never vanished. The memory of real bathing, of heat, of immersion, of the sound of dripping water lingered in songs and tales. Travelers spoke of faraway lands where people bathed daily, where fountains ran in courtyards and streets smelled of soap. Listeners would smile politely, half believing, half doubting. They would imagine for a moment what it might feel like to be surrounded by water again. In that world of frost and firelight, a bath was a rare tenderness. It meant safety, effort, and a brief return to softness. Even the poorest who washed only once a season knew the quiet joy of being clean, if only for a night. The next morning, the world would begin again. Mud on boots, soot on hands, the rhythm of work resuming. But for a few hours, the skin remembered what warmth felt like. That was enough. Enough to keep the ritual alive through centuries of fear and misunderstanding. Enough to remind the body that however fragile, it still belonged to the earth, and that water, even when feared, was still its oldest friend. Dry bathing, the art of cleansing without water. The habit of staying clean without water, what they called dry washing, became a quiet art of survival. Every home had its own version of it. In the corner of a dim room, beside the fire or under the faint light of a candle, someone would prepare a small bowl of warm water. Into it they poured a little vinegar, perhaps a handful of herbs, rosemary, sage, or lavender, if they could afford it. The scent rose gently, not strong enough to perfume the air, but enough to remind them that the world still held small comforts. A piece of soft linen, usually worn thin from years of washing, was dipped into that mixture. The cloth was wrung out carefully so it wouldn't drip. Then the ritual began. Quiet, deliberate, almost meditative. The hands first, because they touched everything. Then the face, the neck, and sometimes the feet. The movements were slow and unhurried, a gentle pressure, a circle of warmth moving across cold skin. For a few minutes, it felt like renewal. This was the Middle Ages version of bathing, not the luxury of immersion, but the tenderness of wiping away the day. People spoke of it not as cleaning, but as calming. To wipe one's face in the morning meant to greet the day with order. To wipe it again before sleep meant to let the body rest. Soap in those days was a complicated thing. It existed, thick, greyish lumps made from animal fat and ashes, but few trusted it. Its smell was sharp and its touch harsh. For skin already rough from cold and wind, it burned more than it soothed, so people preferred cloth and water scented with herbs or vinegar. These simple ingredients felt safer, gentler, familiar. The linen cloth became as essential as bread or firewood. It was washed, boiled, dried in sunlight, and folded neatly by the hearth. To own enough linen was a mark of care, even dignity. People didn't say, "I have bathed." They said, "I have changed my linen." And that meant something. It meant decency, cleanliness, respect. Under the heavy layers of wool tunics and coarse cloaks, linen shirts and undergarments were the invisible protectors. They absorbed sweat, trapped dirt, and shielded the skin from chafing. Changing them often, sometimes once a week, sometimes once every few days, was the closest thing to feeling refreshed. A clean layer of linen against the skin brought quiet comfort, even when everything else felt heavy. Women took particular pride in this. In small stone houses, they hung their linens by the fire after washing, watching the steam rise as the fabric dried. The smell of smoke mixed with rosemary filled the air. Children would press their faces into the warm cloth, breathing in the scent of home. It was simple, practical, and full of tenderness. The process of cleaning clothes was harder than cleaning skin. Water had to be fetched from the well, boiled over fire, mixed with lye or ash, then poured into wooden tubs. Clothes were beaten, wrung, and rinsed in rivers if the weather allowed. But when they were hung to dry and the wind moved through them, it was a small moment of victory. A shirt flapping in the sunlight was a quiet flag of human persistence. Even so, lice and fleas were constant companions. Everyone, rich or poor, fought against them. Combs with fine teeth made from bone or wood were used daily. People would sit near the window, parting each other's hair, hunting for movement in the light. It was a strange intimacy, half grooming, half battle. The clicks of combs and soft murmurs filled the quiet hours. For monks and nuns, hygiene had its own rhythm. Though full baths were rare, washing hands, faces, and feet was often written into their daily duties. Cleanliness was not vanity, it was discipline. A clean body was a sign of order, and order was a form of prayer. In their stone washrooms, bowls of cool water stood ready. The gestures were small, but they carried meaning. A respect for the vessel, that carried the soul. In towns, dry washing became a kind of shared wisdom. Recipes for herbal mixtures passed from one household to another. Some used vinegar mixed with rose petals, others boiled thyme and sage in water to wipe the skin. Wealthier homes might keep small bottles of scented oil, olive or almond, to rub on dry hands and hair. It wasn't about vanity. It was about comfort, a way of reminding the body that it still belonged to itself. The scent of vinegar and herbs lingered in medieval rooms. It clung to wooden tables, to hair, to the folds of linen. Even when water was feared, people sought these small gestures of purity. The act of washing, however limited, was never just about dirt. It was about control, a quiet defiance against decay. When evening came and the work of the day was done, families gathered by the hearth. A basin of warm water was passed around. Each person dipped the cloth, wiped their hands and faces, then handed it on. The youngest children were washed by their mothers, who whispered softly as they did so. The men, silent from fatigue, cleaned their arms and necks, the marks of labor fading under the cloth. In that small ritual there was something more than hygiene. It was care, the shared recognition that the body, no matter how tired or poor, deserved gentleness. The touch of a damp cloth became a language of love. It said, "You have worked enough, now rest." Even travelers carried this habit. On long journeys, they packed small linen squares, bottles of vinegar, and sprigs of herbs tied with string. At night, they would heat a little water over the fire, wipe themselves down and sleep easier. Clean skin meant light dreams. Dry washing wasn't merely the absence of bathing, it was the creation of another kind of purity, one built on texture, scent, and intention. It was the body's way of remembering water without needing to fear it. The people of that time didn't have our understanding of hygiene. They didn't know about germs or infection in the modern sense, but they understood balance, that too much dirt dulled the spirit and too much cleansing risked the body. They lived within that fragile line. Their methods were imperfect, but their purpose was human, to feel for a short while lighter than the weight of their own survival. And so, each night, the same scene repeated across thousands of homes, the bowl, the cloth, the slow, wiping motion. The steam that rose for a few seconds before vanishing into the cold air. The linen folded back neatly. The quiet sigh that followed. That was their bath, not of water, but of warmth and care. In the stillness of those rooms, the medieval world washed itself not through immersion, but through ritual, a ceremony of cloth and patience. And though centuries have passed, the tenderness remains recognizable, the way the hand moves across the skin, the comfort of something warm and clean before sleep. It is a memory that still lives in us. Because in the end, cleanliness was never only about the body. It was about dignity, about love disguised as routine, about the small, steady choice to begin again, no matter how hard the day had been. Hair, teeth, and scent. By the time the day ended and the hearthlight dimmed, another small ritual began. The tending of hair. Medieval hair care was not about vanity but survival. Dust, smoke, and sweat made the scalp ache and the strands stiff. Yet people found ways to soften and tame what the wind and work had tangled. In wooden bowls sat mixtures that could be mistaken for potions. Beaten egg yolks, vinegar steeped with rosemary, or beer left flat overnight. Each had its purpose. Egg yolk was a favorite for those who could spare it. Its warmth and richness gave a kind of sheen to hair that hadn't felt clean in months, Vinegar was sharper, its scent biting through grease and smoke. Beer, oddly enough, gave body and texture. When poured through the hair and combed out, it left behind the faintest sweetness, a reminder that even decay could be repurposed for beauty. Those who could afford imported Castile soap, soft, pale, made with olive oil, were envied for the mild lather it produced. For everyone else, soap was homemade from fat and ash, strong enough to clean, but harsh enough to burn. Combing was both necessary and soothing. Combs made of bone, horn, or carved wood lay beside every basin. They were passed down like heirlooms, the teeth polished smooth by use. Each stroke through the hair pulled out dust, lice, and the day's fatigue. Mothers combed their daughters' braids in the evenings, their hands moving slowly, rhythmically, as if untangling more than just knots. Men sat by the fire and ran the comb through their beards with the same absent devotion. Hair care was quiet conversation, the kind that didn't need words. Lice were constant companions. No one escaped them. Even noble women who wore veils and perfumed oil battled the same invisible armies that plagued the poor. Hair was washed when possible, but more often it was dusted with flour or fine sand, then brushed out, a crude kind of dry shampoo. When infestations grew unbearable, hair was cut short or shaved, especially among monks. Baldness, in that sense, was both a vow and a defense. To keep hair fragrant, people wove herbs into braids or rubbed the scalp with oils infused with lavender, mint, or bay leaves. On feast days, the smell of rosemary mingled with that of bread and wood smoke. For a moment, the world felt less harsh. And then there were the teeth. The quiet record keepers of every meal, every neglect. There were no toothbrushes, no minty pastes. A strip of linen, coarse but clean, served as the main tool. People rubbed their teeth with salt or ash, sometimes with crushed herbs like mint or sage. Charcoal, ground fine, was the most popular remedy. It scrubbed away stains and, briefly, the taste of the day. When done, the linen was rinsed and hung by the window to dry. For those who could afford it, a stick of aromatic wood from hazel or elm was chewed until the end frayed into soft fibers. This became the first toothbrush, a small invention born from instinct. Vinegar or wine was swished in the mouth to freshen breath, though it did as much harm as good, softening enamel with every rinse. Still it felt clean, it burned, and burning meant purity. Toothache was another story. There were no dentists, only barbers with strong arms and iron tools. When a tooth ached beyond endurance, it was pulled. No ceremony, no painkiller, just a hand, a prayer, and the crack of bone. Those who survived the ordeal rinsed their mouths with wine and learned to chew on the other side. Despite it all, medieval people were not as toothless as legend claims. With less sugar in their diet, many kept their teeth well into old age. Bread, cheese, and vegetables wore them down slowly, honestly. Smiles were rare, but when they came, they showed endurance more than beauty. As for smell, well, that was a part of life one could only negotiate, not conquer. The streets smelled of horses, smoke, and earth. Houses smelled of damp wood, wool, and human closeness. Within that mix, everyone carried their own layer of scent, sweat, herbs, and the faint sweetness of linen. To fight the staleness of daily living, people invented small defenses. The pomander was one, a hollow sphere of metal or carved wood, filled with cloves, cinnamon, or dried flowers. It hung from a belt or around the neck, releasing fragrance with every movement. Women carried sachets of lavender or marjoram in their sleeves. Men tucked sprigs of mint behind their collars or dabbed themselves with oil, scented faintly of musk. Perfume when available, came from distant lands and rare ingredients. Rose oil from the east, civet from the glands of a small cat, ambergris from the sea. These scents were both luxury and shield, proof that one belonged to a world slightly above the ordinary stench. But no one, not even the nobility, was truly fragrant. They only managed to smell better than someone else. The air carried layers of effort: vinegar, herbs, sweat, ash. To modern noses, it would seem unbearable. To them, it was simply human. In marketplaces, the mixture of odors was overwhelming. Butchers, tanners, and fishmongers all worked side by side. Spices and rot competed in the air. People learned to live inside that blend, to stop noticing. They said that scent was like weather, something to be endured, not changed. Body odor was treated not as shame, but as nature. To sweat was to live. Physicians even said that blocking sweat could be dangerous, that the body needed to purge itself through scent. So people sweated openly, wiped their foreheads, and carried on. If the odor grew too strong, they reached for alum powder or vinegar. Some rubbed their armpits with crushed herbs, others sprinkled chalk to stay dry. It didn't mask much, but it gave a sense of control. Clothing trapped everything: scent, smoke, time. Wool absorbed odors deeply, and few could afford frequent washing. Instead, people hung garments by the fire or in sunlight, hoping the warmth would chase the smell away. Linen again became salvation, a clean underlayer that could be washed, boiled, and replaced, while the outer clothes remained untouched. Even with all this, scent defined class. A person who smelled faintly of rosewater or mint was assumed to be refined. A person who smelled of sweat and earth was assumed to belong to labor. Smell, like fabric, divided society. And yet when night fell and everyone returned home, the distinctions faded. The same fire warmed them all. The same air filled their lungs. In private, the act of covering one's scent was almost poetic. A lady might press a perfumed handkerchief to her face as she walked through the market, not to insult the poor, but to preserve her illusion of distance. A monk might burn herbs in the corner of his cell, not for fragrance, but to chase away the damp. Each gesture spoke of the same thing: the wish to live more gently in a world that refused to smell clean. And if, in the late evening, someone lifted their linen from the line, still warm from the fire, they might bury their face in it and breathe deeply. For a moment, amid smoke and silence, they would find something close to purity. Not the purity of saints or science, but the fleeting human kind. It was never about smelling perfect. It was about remembering what freshness felt like, even if it lasted only a heartbeat. Linen undergarments, the portable bath. Among the many inventions that shaped daily life in the Middle Ages, none was as quietly transformative as linen, a fabric that became, in its own way, a substitute for bathing. It was light, absorbent, and endlessly washable. When water was feared and soap was scarce, linen carried the burden of cleanliness for everyone. A simple shirt made of it, worn closest to the skin, became a kind of portable bath, a barrier between the body and the world. The fabric had a patience that water lacked. It could take sweat, dirt, and time, and still offer the illusion of freshness. Every morning a clean linen shirt signified a kind of rebirth, no matter how little had changed. When someone changed their linen, they were not only removing a layer of grime, but also a layer of fatigue, of yesterday. It was their way of saying, "I have started again." Linen was more than a fabric, it was a philosophy. To own enough of it was to declare a small victory over circumstance. A white shirt under layers of wool was a sign of care, a quiet self-respect in a world where comfort was rare. People judged each other by it. A clean collar, crisp and pale, spoke louder than perfume. To have linen that stayed white was proof of discipline, of diligence, of a life that still reached toward order. Washing it, though, was an ordeal. There were no soap powders, no basins that drained neatly. Washing meant labor, bending, scrubbing, boiling, beating. The process began at dawn when the air was still cold. Water was fetched from wells or rivers and poured into large tubs. Ash and lye were mixed in, their acrid scent sharp enough to sting the eyes. The linen was soaked until it softened, then beaten against stones or wooden boards to release the dirt. Women worked in silence, their sleeves rolled up, their hands red from the cold. The rhythmic sound of fabric striking rock echoed across the valley like a heartbeat. When the washing was done, the cloths were rinsed in running water, clean enough or simply cleaner than before. They were laid out on the grass, spread wide to catch the wind. In the sunlight, they glowed pale against the earth. Children ran between them, laughing, while women knelt to smooth the corners flat. The scene, though ordinary, was almost sacred, a gathering of effort and air and light. By evening, the linen had dried stiff, smelling faintly of smoke and grass. It was folded carefully, stacked in neat piles, and stored near the hearth where it would stay warm and dry. The next morning, one would be chosen, the cleanest, the softest, and worn close to the skin. Against the rough wool and cold air, it felt like a whisper of comfort. People said that washing linen was like washing the body's shadow. The cleaner the fabric, the cleaner the soul. It was a belief as much as a practice. To keep your linen white was to prove you still cared about your place in the world, that you hadn't surrendered to the mud or the monotony of survival. The wealthy, of course, owned more of it. Their servants washed it often, boiled it until it shone. Nobles sent their linens to be laundered in rivers far from the city, where the water was cleaner. Peasants had fewer pieces, sometimes only one or two, and wore them until they stiffened from sweat. Yet even they would set aside a day to wash, to reclaim some fraction of purity. On wash day, the whole village seemed to breathe together. Lines of white fluttered between houses like flags of surrender or hope. Steam rose from the cauldrons. The smell of ash mingled with the sound of laughter. It was the closest thing to renewal most people knew. Linen also carried meaning beyond cleanliness. It was a mark of intimacy. A shirt washed by someone's hands was a gesture of care. Mothers washed their children's shifts. Wives washed their husbands' tunics. Widows washed what was left behind. To wash another's linen was to touch the unseen, the warmth, the labor, the life that clung to it. Knights wore linen beneath their armor, a thin layer between flesh and iron. It soaked their sweat in battle, sparing the metal from rust. Monks wore it under their robes, softening the austerity of their vows. Even in prayer, they sought the comfort of its coolness. Linen became the unseen companion of every life, noble or poor, devout or worldly. When night fell, the day's shirt was hung near the fire to dry. The smell of heat and smoke wrapped around it, the faint scent of effort. In the morning, it would be warm to the touch. Sliding it over the head, one felt almost human again. This small act, repeated quietly across centuries, was perhaps the truest form of bathing there was. The body adjusted to the rhythm of linen. It learned to rely on layers rather than water, on texture rather than scent. And so, a strange kind of cleanliness emerged, not from soap or steam, but from repetition, from care. Every time the cloth touched the skin, it absorbed the world's roughness, Every time it was washed, that world was made gentle again. The color white became a symbol. In towns and courts, it represented not just purity, but persistence. To wear clean white linen was to show that you had overcome the dirt, that you still had enough strength to fight decay. The poor wore grey from necessity. The rich wore white as proof that their lives were still orderly, still untouched. Yet both, in truth, chased the same feeling, the lightness that comes after being clean. In many ways, linen was the quiet mirror of medieval life, fragile, easily stained, but endlessly restorable. It aged, it tore, it was mended and washed again. No matter how harsh the season, it could be renewed with water, patience, and the sun. And in that cycle, wear, wash, dry, wear, again, people found something close to peace. The linen remembered their labor. It carried their scent, their days, their exhaustion. It bore witness without judgment. When they washed it, they washed their fatigue too, as if each rinse could erase a fragment of hardship. To the modern eye, a clean shirt is ordinary. But to the medieval soul, it was a prayer, a humble one whispered in fabric and water. When they lay their heads down at night, wrapped in linen sheets that had dried in open air, they slept in something sacred. Between skin and sky lay a thin, woven peace, the warmth of cleanliness, hard-earned. The world outside was harsh, but here, between folds of white, there was softness, safety, and the faint memory of sunlight still caught in the threads. And perhaps that was the lesson linen taught, that even in a world without baths, without soap, without comfort, there could still be grace. Cleanliness was not a condition. It was a choice made again and again, with the hands, with the heart, with every wash upon the river's edge. Insects and endurance. At night, when the noise of the day finally sank into silence, another sound began, soft, repetitive, almost rhythmic. The sound of scratching. It was everywhere, in castles and cottages alike. Beneath layers of wool and linen, the human body hosted tiny companions that no one had invited but everyone learned to live with. Lice, fleas, mites. An entire invisible kingdom of persistence. No one was spared. The noblewoman in her silken gown, the monk in his coarse robe, the farmer in his patched tunic, all carried the same restless colony on their skin. Cleanliness, no matter how carefully pursued, ended here. For all their efforts with herbs and linen, for all their scrubbing and fumigation, the insects returned, inevitable as breath. People did not speak of it as shame, it was simply a fact of being alive. You did not get lice, you had lice as naturally as one had hair or hunger. The itch was a quiet reminder that the body, no matter how noble, was still flesh, still porous, still humble. Each household had its methods of resistance. The first line of defense was the comb, a small, delicate tool carved from bone or horn, its teeth so close together they could barely pass a thread of hair. To own one was to own a weapon against discomfort. In the early light, women sat by the window and drew it slowly through each strand, inspecting what the teeth revealed. The comb clicked softly, a rhythm of patience. Children squirmed, men sighed, and mothers worked with the calm endurance of those who know there is no victory, only maintenance. When combing failed, there was heat. Clothes were hung by the fire until the fabric nearly smoked, or laid across hot stones to drive out the hidden crawlers. You could tell when someone was cleaning their garments by the smell, a mixture of wool, smoke, and something faintly alive. People held their shirts close to the embers and listened for the faint pops of death, the tiny sounds of triumph. And sometimes, when patience ran out, the simplest method prevailed: shaving. Men took blades to their scalps, leaving their heads smooth and shining. Monks, already accustomed to humility, made baldness their emblem of purity. For others, it was a surrender, a final attempt at comfort when every other effort had failed. The newly shaven head gleamed with relief, and for a few weeks the nights were quiet again. But the silence never lasted long. Fleas were worse, unpredictable, invisible, until they leapt. They hid in straw mattresses, in rugs, in the folds of wool. When the lights went out, they came alive. The rich covered their beds with layers of linen, believing each barrier would keep the bites away. The poor slept beside the fire, hoping the smoke would drive the pests elsewhere. But the fleas were democratic. They cared for neither class nor comfort. They fed on everyone equally. In the stillness of a medieval night, you could hear the small symphony of endurance, the whisper of cloth against skin, the flick of a finger on a candle flame, the faint rustle of someone turning in bed to escape the itch. There was no outrage in it, only acceptance. For protection, some placed herbs in their bedding, lavender, mint, wormwood, believing the smell would repel the creatures. Others fumigated rooms with burning sage, letting the smoke curl through every corner. The air grew thick and sharp, but the illusion of cleanliness was worth the sting in the eyes. Fleas were also kept at bay by superstition. People wore small charms, silver pendants, or bits of amber around the neck. Some whispered that if you spoke kindly to your fleas, they would not bite so hard. Others laughed and said, "Better bitten by your own than another's." In monasteries, the battle was waged more quietly. Monks washed their robes when allowed, boiled their sheets when they could. But even behind thick stone walls, the fleas persisted. During prayer, a scratch might interrupt the silence, a humble reminder that the divine was never free from the flesh. And still, life went on. People laughed, worked, fell in love, and scratched. Children chased each other through fields, their hair glinting in the sun, full of life in every sense. Lovers brushed lint from one another's sleeves and pretended not to notice the movement beneath. A mother might cradle her sleeping child and stroke their scalp, her fingers moving not only with affection, but vigilance. The rhythm of care was inseparable from the rhythm of survival. When infestations grew unbearable, entire garments were burned. The loss was painful. Every shirt, every blanket took hours of labor to make, but sometimes it was the only way. The fire hissed as fabric turned to smoke. Watching it rise, people spoke softly, as though attending a funeral for something both personal and persistent. Yet not even fire could end the cycle for long. Within weeks, the itch returned. The human body was too warm, too alive a home to be abandoned. The pests came back, drawn by the scent of sweat and the quiet promise of blood. It was not failure, only the way of things. To modern ears, this sounds unbearable. But for them, it was simply life. A constant negotiation between discomfort and endurance. They accepted the itch the way they accepted the rain or the cold. It was unpleasant, but it was honest. Some nights, families sat together by candlelight, picking through each other's hair with patient fingers. The sound of nails against scalp, the soft pluck of removal, filled the air. It was an act both practical and intimate, a wordless care that bound people together. To delouse someone was to show affection. It meant closeness, trust, time. Fleas had their own strange poetry. They reminded people that the body was shared, that the boundary between self and world was never absolute. You could not fully escape another creature's touch. Every living thing depended in some small way on another. The idea was uncomfortable, but also grounding. In the quiet hours when scratching replaced conversation, it was a kind of meditation, the reminder that even kings were never entirely alone. By morning, the itch softened. The body adjusted, lulled by exhaustion. People rose, shook out their blankets, dressed, and stepped into the day as if nothing had happened. The night's small war faded into routine. In this endless struggle, there was a kind of humility. The insects did not discriminate, and so they became the great equalizers. They bit the rich and the poor with the same indifference, reminding all that flesh was flesh. You could build walls, wear silk, and pray for deliverance. Still the itch would find you. Perhaps that was the truest hygiene of the age, not freedom from dirt or discomfort, but the acceptance of what could not be conquered. Cleanliness in such a world was measured not by absence but by grace. The grace to endure, to keep combing, to keep washing, to keep trying. And so beneath the flicker of the oil lamp, someone scratches softly, someone else combs in silence, and the night stretches on, full of small, stubborn lives, both human and otherwise, learning to coexist. Toilets and soap. When it came to the most private acts of daily life, the ones no one spoke of but everyone shared, the medieval world had its own rough wisdom. There was no shame in necessity, only the matter of where and how to manage it. And so the story of hygiene extended all the way to the most humble corners, to the toilets, to the soap, to the unspoken art of keeping decency in a world that knew very little comfort. In castles, the privileged few had what were called garderobes, narrow stone chambers built high along the walls, with a simple wooden bench and a round hole carved through its center. Below, gravity did the rest. The waste dropped straight down into the open air, sometimes into a pit, sometimes into a moat, and sometimes, regrettably, onto a patch of ground no one wished to walk near. The wind carried the smell away, and the sound of the drop was the only evidence left. It was crude, but it worked. Servants would occasionally pour buckets of water or ash down the chute to keep it from clogging, though clean was a generous term. In winter, the stone seat froze cold against bare skin. In summer, the smell rose like a living thing. Still, among nobles, the garderobe was considered a luxury, an enclosed space, private, separate, a small dignity in a time when privacy itself was rare. For everyone else, there were simpler solutions. Peasants used the edge of fields, the forest, or the riverbank. Villages sometimes shared a single pit behind the houses, a shallow hole surrounded by tall grass. People went early in the morning or after dusk when the world was quiet. The ground froze in winter, cracked in summer, and smelled faintly of life returning to the earth. Waste, like everything else, went back to the soil. In towns, chamber pots were the great equalizer. Every home, no matter how humble, had one, a small ceramic or wooden bowl kept beneath the bed. During the night, it saved a cold walk into the darkness. In the morning, someone would lift the pot carefully, walk to the window, and pour its contents into the street below. "Garde à l'eau," they shouted in French towns. "Watch out for the water," before letting gravity handle the rest. The streets, already filled with horses and refuse, simply absorbed the new offering. Rain helped. So did the pigs, which roamed freely and served as the city's accidental cleaners. The air of medieval towns was a mingling of smoke, damp earth, bread baking, and humanity's unending cycle. It sounds unpleasant to us, and it was, but to them it was ordinary. The background rhythm of existence. The nose learned to forgive what the eyes could not avoid. For wiping, people used whatever was near. In the countryside, handfuls of straw, leaves, or moss. In winter, snow, cold but clean. In towns, scraps of cloth or wool. The wealthy sometimes used soft linen rags that were washed and reused. The poor made do with whatever nature offered. There was no embarrassment in it, only practicality. And yet, amid this rawness, there were moments of surprising care. Bathing might have been rare, but the instinct to cleanse never disappeared. Even the act of washing hands after such tasks was valued. A ritual before meals, after labor, before prayer. Water, though feared in excess, was still sacred in small amounts. When people spoke of soap, they spoke with both respect and caution. The earliest medieval soaps were born not from comfort, but from necessity. Harsh, strong, more suited to scrubbing cloth than skin. The recipe was simple but dangerous: animal fat boiled with lye, a caustic liquid made by soaking ashes in water. The smell was sharp, like smoke trapped in oil. The result? A heavy, wax-like block that could strip away grease, dirt, and sometimes, unfortunately, the outer layer of skin. To make it was an act of endurance. The fire had to be kept steady for hours. The mixture had to be stirred slowly until it thickened and cooled. The smoke stung the eyes, and the air filled with the smell of tallow, the ghost of burned fat. When the soap hardened, it was cut into rough pieces and stored in cloth. People didn't use it lightly. For laundry, yes. For hands, sometimes. For the body, rarely. Those who did often mixed herbs into the soap: rosemary, thyme, mint, lavender. Not to change its nature, but to soften its impression. The faint fragrance turned something brutal into something almost kind. Southern Europe led the Quiet Revolution. In places like Spain and Italy, where olive oil was plentiful, a gentler soap began to emerge. Castile soap, they called it. Pale, smooth, made not from tallow, but from oil. It lathered softly and smelled faintly of the fields. It didn't burn the skin, it even left it supple. To own a bar of Castile soap was to own a touch of refinement, a glimpse of comfort that felt almost luxurious. But in Northern Europe, where olive trees did not grow, the harsh version remained. People learned to respect its strength. They used it to clean linen, to wash floors, to scrub pots. In some households, soap was kept under lock and key, a resource too valuable to waste. Laundry day, with its vats of hot water and heaps of ash soap, was the closest thing to a communal ritual of cleansing. Steam filled the air, blending with laughter and gossip. The smell of boiling fat and wet fabric hung over the fields. Hands, red from lye, moved tirelessly, scrubbing away the evidence of the week. When the work ended and the garments were laid out to dry, the world seemed briefly renewed. The linens fluttered in the wind, shining pale under the sun. The same soap that could burn skin had, in the end, brought back a sense of purity, even if it belonged only to the fabric, not the flesh. Some people believed the smell of soap itself could ward off sickness. They would carry small shavings of it wrapped in cloth, tucked into sleeves or hung near the bed. It wasn't science, but it was comfort. And sometimes, comfort was enough. In wealthier homes, soap became a small gift, something exchanged between families or kept in carved wooden boxes as though it were treasure. The smoother it looked, the finer the maker. Some artisans experimented with coloring it using herbs or flowers, creating subtle shades of green or yellow. A few even pressed patterns into the surface, a mark of pride, a maker's signature. Still, for most of the world, soap remained a tool, not a pleasure. The body, they believed, was better left untouched by such strong substances. Nature, not chemistry, would handle the rest. And so the rhythm of life continued, the chamber pot emptied, the streets rinsed by rain, the clothes scrubbed and hung, the soap saved and sparingly used. It was not a clean world, not by our standards, but it was a world of balance between effort and endurance, between what could be washed and what had to be accepted. At night, as fires burned low and windows closed against the chill, the air inside carried the faint trace of soap and smoke. The smell was not pleasant, but it was familiar. It told people they had worked, that they had tried, that tomorrow would come and bring its own dirt again. Cleanliness was not perfection. It was persistence. And in that persistence, in every rinsed cloth, every bucket poured from a high window, every bar of soap slowly wearing down to nothing, there was dignity. Because even in a world without plumbing, perfume, or polish, human beings still reached for the same thing we reach for now. The small, stubborn piece of feeling clean, even if just for a moment. When cleanliness became a part of dignity. By the late Middle Ages, something began to shift, quietly, almost invisibly, in the way people thought about being clean. It wasn't about bathing or soap or luxury anymore. It was about dignity. The idea that to be presentable, to be composed, was a reflection not only of health, but of character. People didn't know what bacteria were. They didn't understand microbes or hygiene in the modern sense. But they understood order. They knew that when things were neat, the mind felt calmer. And when the body was cared for, the day felt more bearable. It wasn't cleanliness as science, it was cleanliness as self-respect. A cobbler might rinse his hands in vinegar before stitching leather. A merchant might wipe his face with a cloth dampened in rosewater before greeting a customer. A servant might polish her shoes, not for praise, but because dull leather looked like defeat. Across towns and villages, small acts of care began to signal something deeper. A person's sense of worth, their awareness of how they met the world. People started to understand that filth was more than dirt. It was disorder. It was chaos made visible. A clean face, brushed hair, or fresh linen became signs that a person was still trying, still disciplined, still holding the line against the world's weight. The morning ritual, modest as it was, carried this quiet strength. Before sunrise, people washed their faces and hands with cold water, a shock that woke the body and steadied the mind. Some used vinegar or wine diluted with herbs, others relied on plain water from a wooden bucket. It wasn't indulgence, it was preparation. The act of readying oneself for whatever the day demanded. A woman tied her hair with care, brushed until the strands lay smooth. A man wiped the dust from his boots, rebuttoned his tunic, and straightened his belt. These gestures were small, but together they created the feeling of decency. It was the closest many would come to beauty. And in a world without mirrors for most, the proof of cleanliness wasn't how you looked, but how you felt. The coolness of washed hands, the lightness of fresh fabric, the faint scent of herbs lingering on the skin. Those sensations were a kind of peace, a reminder that even in poverty there was a boundary between person and dirt, self and world. In cities, this quiet value took on new meaning. Streets were crowded, trade was booming, and the smell of humanity was everywhere. Amid the chaos, people found pride in being clean. A merchant's apprentice might scrub the shop floor before customers arrived. Housewives swept doorsteps and threw buckets of water into the street, not just to wash away waste, but to make their homes appear cared for. Cleanliness became a signal of respectability. In inns and taverns, travelers could tell the quality of a place by its air. Whether the tables were sticky, whether the straw on the floor was new. Patrons didn't expect perfection, but they noticed effort. Clean corners meant honest business, even the poorest tried in their way. A beggar might rinse in a fountain before asking for bread. A washerwoman might scrub her hands raw to keep them free of stains. They had little, but cleanliness gave them something that poverty couldn't touch, a fragment of control. The church, too, began to echo this idea, not with sermons of sin, but with quiet encouragement. Monks spoke of inner purity reflected in outer order. Priests reminded their flocks that cleanliness honored not vanity, but creation itself. To wash was to acknowledge that one's body, however humble, was worth care. It was in these centuries that the concept of hygiene and morality began to blur. People still avoided full baths, fearing illness, but they believed that tidiness kept both the spirit and the house safe. A dirty home was thought to attract misfortune, and a disheveled appearance hinted at inner decay. In many ways, the medieval sense of hygiene was psychological before it was physical. The body was not something to be perfected but maintained, kept in a state of readiness. Clean hands before a meal, brushed hair before mass, a swept floor before sleep. These acts were small, repetitive, ordinary, and yet they carried immense symbolic weight. Cleanliness over time became part of reputation. When merchants described someone as respectable, they didn't mean rich, they meant clean. A man whose tunic was washed, whose hair was combed, and whose nails were trimmed was trustworthy. A woman whose apron was spotless was honorable. In towns where reputation was currency, cleanliness was its quiet economy. Even tools and workplaces followed the rule. A well-kept forge, an orderly stall, a tidy kitchen. These reflected the mind of their keeper. A messy workspace suggested carelessness, even danger. To maintain cleanliness was to maintain trust. And perhaps this was where hygiene began to transcend class. For the first time, the poor and the rich could share one virtue equally: order. You might not own gold or silk, but you could wash your face. You could fold your clothes, you could appear before others as someone composed, someone who respected themselves and the life they were given. It was not about luxury, it was about presence. When evening came and the day's labor ended, many washed again before bed, not out of ritual but relief. The water was cool, the cloth rough, but the feeling was gentle. As the dirt lifted from the skin, so too did the heaviness of the day. The body could rest easier, knowing it had been tended to. This, then, was the unspoken philosophy of medieval cleanliness, that the world may be chaotic, but the self need not be. You could not control plague, famine, or weather, but you could control your corner of the world, your clothes, your hair, your hands. People found meaning in this control. It made them feel grounded, dignified, even in hardship. When a peasant stepped into the market with a freshly washed face, he was not only clean, he was visible. He could meet others' eyes. He could take part in the shared dignity of being human. And perhaps that was the true transformation of the age. Cleanliness had become not just about hygiene, but about humanity. It was no longer only for comfort or survival, but for belonging. The quiet act of saying, I am here, I care, I am part of this world. In that way, washing one's hands in vinegar, changing a shirt, brushing one's hair, these were not trivial acts. They were small, daily affirmations of identity. They were proof that even in a world of mud, smoke, and uncertainty, people still sought grace. 1,000 years later, when soap and water became common, the principle remained the same. To be clean is not only to be free of dirt, but to honor the self that endures beneath it. And it all began here, in the Middle Ages, when a basin of cold water, a cloth, and a moment of care became the first mirror of one's inner life. The city of water and brick. Long before medieval streets echoed with the clatter of horses and the scent of smoke, there were cities built from sunlight, water, and the logic of the earth. These ancient places, older than memory, knew something that later centuries would forget. That cleanliness began not with soap or prayer, but with design. The story begins thousands of years ago in a land where heat shimmered above baked clay and the air smelled faintly of dust and river. There, on the banks of the Indus, stood Mohenjo-daro, a city so orderly it could have been planned by the gods themselves. Streets crossed one another in perfect right angles. Houses faced the wind to catch its coolness. Beneath the ground, water moved quietly through a system of covered drains. Brick-lined, sloped with mathematical precision. Every home, no matter how small, had its own well and its own bathing area where clean water entered and dirty water left without a sound. It was not luxury, it was logic. The people of Mohenjo-daro understood that hygiene was architecture, that purity could be built. They did not divide the city into chaos and filth. They designed it so that cleanliness was part of its rhythm, woven into every street, every brick, every flow of water. Even their great bath, set upon the citadel mound, was less a monument and more a meditation. A space of ritual washing surrounded by corridors where silence carried the scent of wet clay. In the evening light, the bricks glowed red and the water in the pools turned dark and still. People came not to display wealth or piety, but to return themselves to balance. To rinse away the dust of the day was not vanity, it was belonging. To the city, to the river, to the pattern of life itself. When you walk through those ruins today, the sense of design still feels alive. The drains, long dry, trace lines of human reason through the earth. The walls, though broken, still suggest precision, an insistence that order and cleanliness are not separate from civilization, but its foundation. Far to the west, across the shifting sands and into the heart of Mesopotamia, another city rose, Babylon. It was different from the quiet geometry of the Indus. Babylon was loud, grand, layered in gold and ambition. Its walls were vast enough to hold entire neighborhoods within, and its streets curved with the Euphrates like ribbons of clay and water intertwined. Here, water was not hidden underground, it was celebrated. Canals ran beside roads carrying life through the city. Some led to gardens where palms and cypress trees swayed above tiled courtyards. Others flowed past temples and markets where traders washed their hands before counting coins. The sound of water was everywhere, trickling, echoing, cooling the dust. Even in the houses, clay pipes carried waste away from courtyards and kitchens, channeling it back to the river. And stamped into many of those bricks was the name of a king, Nebuchadnezzar, as if to remind everyone that even drainage was an act of power, a promise that order would flow downward, washing the city clean. To walk through Babylon must have felt like walking through a living organism, the streets as veins, the canals as arteries, the walls as bones. Cleanliness was not moral, it was mechanical. The city breathed through its water. And though its temples rose in devotion to gods, its greatest act of reverence was practical, controlling the flood, guiding the current, mastering the flow between life and decay. The Babylonians knew that water could bless or destroy. To build a city was to learn its temperament, to make peace with what could not be tamed. Across an ocean and centuries later, another civilization carved its vision into stone, Teotihuacan in the Valley of Mexico. From above, its plan looks almost impossible, a vast, geometric order stretching across miles, aligned with the stars. Its main avenue, the so-called Avenue of the Dead, was not a road for mourning, but a corridor of meaning. It connected pyramids, plazas, and homes in a perfect symmetry that reflected both the heavens and the earth. But beneath this beauty lay something more human. A network of drains and channels carefully built beneath courtyards and compounds. Water here did not only serve the body, it served the city's balance with nature. Rainwater was collected, guided, and stored. Wastewater was carried away through hidden channels, out of sight but never out of mind. Even ordinary dwellings had small courtyards paved to let water run smoothly toward these systems. Teotihuacan's people understood what Mohenjo-Daro and Babylon also knew, that to live cleanly was to live in harmony with flow. Not to fight water, but to guide it. In the dry season, when the air shimmered with heat, priests climbed the pyramid steps to offer thanks to the rain gods, not for vanity, but for survival. Below, the streets remained dry and orderly, the city ready for whatever the sky would give. The ancients might not have spoken of hygiene in our terms, but they practiced it in ways we still struggle to master. They knew that cleanliness was not a habit of individuals. It was a discipline of societies. It was the way a city respected its water, the way it respected its own boundaries between pure and impure, sacred and waste. And perhaps that is what makes these places so haunting. Thousands of years later, the bricks still line up, the drains still slope correctly, the wells still stand where they once fed life. They remain as quiet evidence that the idea of civilization and of keeping oneself and one's world clean is older than memory, older than writing. In Mohenjo-Daro, they cleaned the streets after rain. In Babylon, they washed their hands before touching bread. In Teotihuacan, they let water run beneath their homes, out of sight, but always flowing. Each city, in its own way, sought to guide what could not be stopped. Even now, under layers of time and dust, those drains are still there, empty, waiting, a reminder that to keep the world livable, one must always decide where the water will go. If you listen closely, the story they tell is not one of perfection, but of patience. Civilization was never about shining marble or golden walls. It was about the quiet intelligence of channels that never overflowed, of courtyards that dried clean, of hands that washed and built and washed again. In those ancient streets, where sunlight glinted off wet stone, people learned the same truth that medieval towns would rediscover centuries later. That cleanliness is not the absence of dirt, but the mastery of it, the art of directing what life constantly brings. And so the lineage continues from the Indus to Mesopotamia to the Valley of Mexico, from clay to brick to stone. The materials change, but the rhythm remains. Water drawn, used, and returned. Cities breathing through their drains, people surviving through design. In the end, the most sacred structure of all was not the temple or the tower. It was the unseen drain, the simple promise that the world, however chaotic, could be kept in balance if one only knew how to let the water flow. Zoning, the order of stone and wind. The city was alive even when it seemed asleep. Beneath the cobblestones, a quiet system of order worked without praise, drains that caught the rain, channels that guided it away, and narrow pipes that whispered beneath the streets like the veins of a living body. By day, markets hummed with trade. Bakers shouted over the scent of bread, smiths hammered sparks into the air, and traders laid out silks that fluttered like flags. Yet underneath this chaos, the city remained calm, structured, almost self-aware. The placement of homes, workshops, wells, and courtyards was not random. It was deliberate. Centuries before modern sanitation, urban planners already knew. Where there is order, there is cleanliness. Rain fell often in those early cities. When it did, people didn't run or hide, they listened. The water found its path, slipping down tiled roofs, through grooves carved into stone, into open drains that led the flow toward the fields. The streets, built with a slight incline, never flooded for long. Even in silence, the city knew how to breathe. Each block had its rhythm, homes facing the morning light, workshops turned toward shade, markets near the wells. It was not luxury, it was logic, a design that balanced heat and hygiene, sunlight and silence. People lived close to their work, but not to their waste. The craftsmen's quarters stood near the wind's path, so that smoke and dust could drift away by afternoon. Bakeries and dye shops were placed downstream, letting the city's pulse stay clean. In this way, zoning, though no one called it that, became an instinct, a kind of civic common sense. It was not imposed by kings, but shaped by time, by generations watching how wind and water moved. Where the air was cool, homes were built. Where the ground stayed wet, gardens grew. The old builders understood that a city was a mirror of its people. If the drains clogged, so did the streets. If the markets overflowed with filth, so did the spirit of its citizens. To keep a city clean was to keep its people in balance. Even temples followed this rhythm. They were placed not just at the center of power, but at the center of flow, where water could cleanse before worship began. Visitors washed their hands and feet before stepping onto the cool stone floors. The act was practical, yes, but also symbolic. Purity was not just moral, it was spatial. As time passed, this sense of harmony became more refined. Builders began carving narrow channels along the edges of streets. Cisterns were placed below courtyards to collect rainwater. Wastewater flowed beneath the roads in clay pipes, covered and silent. When morning came and the market reopened, no one thought of these hidden systems. They were simply there, invisible, like the heartbeat of the city itself. From above, you would have seen a pattern, not chaos, but geometry. Houses in straight lines, streets crossing like threads, plazas spaced with the precision of breath. This was not an accident. It was a philosophy made of stone, that life should move as water moves, downward, steady, unblocked. Even in the noise of the market, that order remained. Fishmongers washed their stalls at dusk. Children fetched water from clean wells built far from waste pits. The same flow that carried away filth brought freshness back in return. The people didn't speak of hygiene as a concept. They simply practiced it by living inside a design that respected nature's own logic. When the first rain of the season fell, roofs shimmered, drains sang, and the scent of earth rose like incense. The city exhaled. The water washed away the dust that had gathered in silence, sweeping through alleys and markets, through stone gutters and underground tunnels, until it rejoined the river, clean again, ready again. Zoning in that ancient sense was not about power or property. It was about breathing space, about giving each function of the city its rightful distance. The butcher from the baker, the market from the well, the waste pit from the street. The city was not built against nature, but with it. Even centuries later, when walls rose higher and crowds grew denser, this wisdom remained buried under the noise. Medieval towns that forgot it soon drowned in their own neglect. Streets became swamps. Disease followed the rivers of filth. But where the old principles were remembered, the slope of the road, the placement of drains, the separation of work and rest, life continued with quiet health. People didn't know the word urban planning, but they knew balance. They sensed it when the air was clear, when the streets stayed dry after rain, when markets smelled of spice instead of rot. It was the invisible virtue of a well-made city, one that cleansed itself with every sunrise. At night, when lamps burned low and only the sound of distant water remained, the city seemed to whisper through its own architecture. The drains gurgled softly. The wind moved through empty streets, sweeping the last traces of dust toward the river. From the rooftops, it was possible to see the pattern even in darkness, a grid of intention, of restraint, of human rhythm tuned to natural law. That was the heart of zoning, not division, but harmony. The recognition that every place had its purpose, and when those purposes aligned, when the butchers smoke, the markets chatter, the temples calm and the rivers pull, all found their place. The city became something more than a collection of walls. It became a living organism. And just as the human body keeps itself clean by circulation, so too did the city when designed with care. The drains were its veins, the streets its arteries, the wind its breath. As long as these remained open and balanced, the city stayed alive. That was the secret the ancients knew, and that every age must relearn, that sanitation is not just plumbing, and order is not control. They are both forms of respect. Respect for water, for wind, for space. Respect for the quiet truth that where there is flow, there is life. And when the morning came, and the sun rose again on roofs still damp with rain, the people of those cities, builders, merchants, children, stepped out into streets that glistened clean. The air was new, the ground firm, and beneath it all the invisible systems worked still, silent, tireless, ancient as breath. The ancient waters. From the first clay drains to the marble domes that touched the sky, one idea endured. The wish to keep the world clean, to keep it whole. Civilizations rose and fell, but the rhythm stayed. Water flowed through stone channels, through copper pipes, through iron and glass, till it reached the hands of another generation, still washing, still rebuilding, still learning the same quiet discipline. Every age found its own version of order. In the Indus, it was symmetry. In Babylon, it was the hum of water beside temples. In Rome, it was the bath, warm and echoing with conversation. In the Middle Ages, it was linen against the skin, soap against the cloth, dignity against decay. To keep clean was not just to survive, it was to remember. That even when the world was rough, the body was worth tending, that behind every stone wall and wooden tub was a hand that cared enough to lift water, to pour, to rinse, to make something right again. As centuries passed, the tools changed, but the sound did not. A bucket filled, a drain whispered, a basin emptied, the music of cleanliness. The oldest song we know, it played in every courtyard and every street, from the hum of Rome's aqueducts to the splash of a peasant washing her hands in a wooden bowl. Now, when we open a tap and hear the rush of water, we are hearing them. Those who came before us, who built order from mud and silence. Every drop carries their patience, every flow their intention. The night draws near, the air grows still, as if the cities of the past are holding their breath. Somewhere under the ground, old drains still rest, dry, waiting, and the faint echo of water continues its endless journey through time. Sleep, then, among the quiet cities of history. Let the world fade into the hush of running water, and remember to clean, to build, to care. Has always been the same prayer spoken in different tongues,